The music was faint at first, as if it were being carried on the wind from a mile away. Annalie cocked her head, straining to hear its tune, and then rose from her chair to start down the hall toward a room full of people dressed in their finest. She nodded to those who acknowledged her presence, and wondered why they didn't seem to hear what she heard. She searched the crowd for any sign of the whistler, and finally moved into the music room. Tom was there whistling, leaning against the piano, which was now pouring out the same melody without having a player at its keys. He finished the song, grinned, and crossed the room to her. "Let's go outside. I can't hear a thing with all these people." The next moment they were walking in the woods near the creek. Light from the full moon bounced off the minnows that flitted to and fro in the water, and made the stream look like a sky full of shooting stars. Tom jumped up to swing from one of the low branches surrounding them, and then landed on the ground in front of Annalie, took her hands, and started spinning. "What are you doing?" she laughed. He let go of her hands and stood before her, singing words she couldn't understand. Annalie's smile faded as she saw a gray figure steal up behind her brother. She tried to call Tom's name, but no sound would come from her throat. She pointed in the stranger's direction, but Tom would not turn around. Finally, she rushed toward him. He caught his breath as a bayonet ran through him from behind. Annalie couldn't stop her momentum and pushed him further onto the bayonet as she ran into it herself. She felt the blade go through her chest. It didn't hurt. She looked from the shining metal to Tom's eyes. They were already vacant. She glanced back down to the bayonet and listened to herself breathe, heard the crackle of blood in her lungs, and felt it welling up. She breathed deliberately. One breath. One breath. One long draw of air into her lungs, deeper and deeper, until they burst. Annalie jolted awake and grabbed the arms of her chair at the sound of her book falling from her lap to the floor. She looked to the clock on the mantel, chiding herself for having fallen asleep during the day, and then took a long breath before heading for the stairs. The house seemed empty this time she descended. She started down the hall and peered into rooms as she went in hopes of finding someone. She stopped in the doorway of the music room and stiffened. Mr. Scott was standing next to the piano and staring out at the oak tree by the window. Annalie's skirts rustled as she walked into the room, but he didn't acknowledge her until she spoke. "Where is everyone?" "They're all outside." He turned around to face her. "I met your older sister while you were napping." "She's outside too?" Annalie sat at the piano. "She said she was determined to get out of the house." Annalie smiled. Mr. Scott moved away from the window and toward the opposite wall. He looked up at the portrait there. "Is that your brother?" "Yes." He examined it a bit longer and frowned. "What?" Annalie asked. "Nothing. He just looks different than I imagined." "What did you think he would look like?" "Well, more like you, I suppose." "Oh, Tom took after his mother. He and Rebecca were from Papa's first marriage, you see. Tom's mother died when he was born. Papa has a portrait of her packed away somewhere. Rebecca looks exactly like her. That's why she has such nice straight hair and I have this flyaway mop the color of dirty dishwater." "There's nothing wrong with your hair," he said, still staring at the portrait. Annalie glanced from her brother's image to the back of Mr. Scott's head, and then stood up. "I interrupted you a moment ago. I'll go out with the others." She started for the door, but his voice stopped her. "Thank you for the walk earlier." Annalie gazed at him a moment. "You're welcome." Friday, 30 September 1853. There's been a great sharing of culture in our home today, with the promise of many more such days to follow. I decided to bring Will along fishing this morning, since Mother has finally allowed him to leave his sick bed. I asked Father if little Henry could leave off his chores to join us. He said it was my responsibility to see that Henry's work gets done, so the decision should be mine. I figured fishing was the more pressing business. Besides, I could always help Henry finish the chores if it came down to it. Will wasn't so bad this trip. I felt I owed him a day of peace after my part in landing him in the bed in the first place, and I found that if I don't torment him, He's ever so much more tolerable. This is not to say I should take him with us every day. He talks too much, and asks questions about everything under the sky, and gets his line tangled as soon as I turn my back on him, and can't bait a hook so the fish won't strip the worm, no matter how often Henry or I show him. But he is a first-rate digger, and found some of the fattest, juiciest worms I've seen. I must show him more civility after his revealing such a talent as that. My second exchange of knowledge came this afternoon from a most unexpected quarter. Caroline caught me writing out a list of items I wished to buy when we ride into town, and demanded that I show her how to make letters too. I told her she might have a tutor when she grew a bit, but her insistence won me enough to help me form her first letter. She showed her gratitude by running to bring her sewing kit, which consists of a few rags, some thread, and an overlarge needle. My little teacher showed me how to make a running stitch. Even at her age, her stitches are more even than mine. Perhaps women are born with an eye for fine detail, or else with enough patience to pay attention to such things. A running stitch may be a useful thing, but I'll stick to fish and books. Teague watched Miss Warner cross the yard to join her family in the gazebo, and then left the window for the piano seat she had just occupied. He leaned his elbows on the key cover and held his forehead with both hands. The reflection of his face in the polished black wood of the key cover was one whose unfamiliarity still jarred him. After nearly 6 months of convalescence, his face still bore traces of emaciation. The beard didn't help like he had thought it would. He would shave it tomorrow. He'd keep his mustache, though, having formed a habit of stroking it when he was thinking. He ran his thumb and forefinger over it now. Besides, it would prove to Aubrey that he could grow one. He sighed and craned his neck back until it popped. Now here was something Aubrey could laugh at. Here was a man who had sworn off family money and everything that didn't require a day's work to receive. Here was this man living rent-free with a family comfortable in a fortune made 2 generations before. His host was a doctor for lack of anything better to do. He hacked people's legs off as a hobby. No, that wasn't fair. He didn't deserve what Dr. Warner was doing for him, even if he did have to endure a not-so-subtle attempt at soul-saving every once in a while. There was really no sense in it all. Warner had a dead son, a dying daughter, a touched wife, and now he'd thrown a cripple into the mix. Teague sucked air in through his teeth at the dull throbbing at the end of his stump. He'd tried to ignore it for the last hour. He put his hand on it as though the action would cover the pain, then drew it back and grimaced at the sensation through his pants of the flap of skin covering the end of his knee and the ridge of the scar that ran along the bottom of it. His father had often said pain makes a man, but being a man was highly overrated. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his pill case. DePriest had told him 1 every 4 hours, but that didn't work any more. Teague would have to talk with him about that. He swallowed 2 of the pills, then clicked the case shut and stared at it. Sunlight glinted off the metal like the glare off a bayonet. He closed his eyes against the gleam and put the case back into his jacket. The sound of movement behind him made him snap around. DePriest's daughter was sitting under a lamp table, partially hidden by a chair. She was sucking her thumb and watching him while she held onto a rag doll by its arm. Teague leaned his head over to get a better view. "Hello." She didn't reply, but only took her thumb out of her mouth. They stared at each other a moment longer, and Teague tried again. "What's her name?" He motioned to the doll. Again there was no answer. Teague moved to get up, but stopped when Lucy bolted out from under the table and down the hall. "Well, I'm just not getting anything right today." He stood and crossed again to the window. The family was probably sitting in the orchard's gazebo talking about him. He was a novelty. A simple-minded novelty. He'd make a point of staying out of everyone's way, especially Miss Warner's, whose slight shoulders seemed never to relax. He watched the leaves moving against the sky for a moment, and then looked down to where the family was crossing the yard back to the house. Dr. and Mrs. Warner led the way, and Dr. DePriest was listening to something the older man was telling him. The two daughters walked after them. Miss Warner slipped her hand into her sister's grasp. Teague stayed at the window while he listened to the sounds of the family entering the house, and below it all, the steady thump, thump, thump of footfalls on the stairs. An even rhythm, not tap, thump, tap, thump. Teague left his place at the window and went down the hall toward the front door. "Captain, are you hungry? Could you take a bit of luncheon?" Mrs. Warner asked. "Thank you, ma'am, but I believe I'm more tired than anything." He turned to Dr. Warner. "If it's all right, may I ask you where you want me to stay?" "I just sent John up to get a bed ready to bring down. I suppose we'll put you in the music room. We don't use it much anymore." "Don't put yourselves out on my account. You can leave the bed where it is. I'll go up there." "That's not wise." "All due respect, sir, but I must learn to do for myself sometime." "At least let me help you, then." "I don't need any help." Teague placed one crutch under his arm and balanced himself with a hand on the banister, and then hoisted his foot on the first step. He let out the breath he had been holding and moved his hand further up the banister to steady his next hop. That was 2. Teague made his way up to 4 before he heard a footstep behind him. He turned to see Dr. Warner braced on the bottom step to catch him if he fell. The women were watching him from the floor, their bonnets and shawls hanging limp and forgotten in their hands. Teague faced forward again, bowed his head, and gritted his teeth. So now he was a baby. He sighed and continued. 5, 6, 7, landing. He stopped again. His breath was coming fast now, and his arms and back ached. He could feel Dr. Warner was still only a couple of steps behind him. Hang it all. 8, 9, 10, 11. A moment's rest. 12, 13, 14. Top. Teague moved his extra crutch to the other arm, turned, and studied the onlookers. Dr. Warner looked impressed. Mrs. DePriest was fairly beaming, but Miss Warner appeared almost disapproving. He dismissed the expressions. "Which room is it?" he asked his host. "I'll show you."